that moving forward against Mahomes?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, Miami's got two corners that are incredibly physical. Howard and Jones are physical, long, violent corners. 3 interceptions, box score. I get it. 2 of them are on tips. Okay, one of them is a ridiculous play by Van Ginkel to get down on the ground, tip the ball up, and the other one is a ball off a tailback's hands. It's a little high and hot, but so, that you got to take into context. And then that Howard interception, the one-hander is a great play. I don't think that there's a lot that teams are going to take that Miami did that you can kind of replicate. You got to have the corners to do it. They don't. You got to have the exotic pressures that Miami does, and a lot of teams don't. And so I'd say this about that football game yesterday. The Chiefs do everything in football that you're not supposed to do, and they still are incredible to watch. Like you guys have heard this, you just can't flip the switch. Yes, they can. They're the only team I've ever seen that could play as poorly as they do for stretches, and then they have a quarterback that can flip the switch, and a receiver that can flip the switch, and Tyreek Hill. They have the offensive player of the year. Travis Kelce's the best player in football that's not a quarterback. He's the offensive player of the year. He just flips switches, and it's like, we'll score 21 in a matter of like 3 minutes. And they had 4 turnovers. You're not supposed to be able to turn a football over 4 times and win in the NFL. They were up 21 with 4 turnovers. And so they kind of break those cliches that we know of football. That being said, I thought Miami was one of the most impressive teams I watched yesterday. Like the way that they hung in that football game. Tua got incredibly hot. He's throwing to guys that I don't necessarily know of as household names. His ball placement and his timing and the subtlety that he plays with is remarkable. Miami's as good as I think they are. Kansas City's just them by themselves. They can just do things. They're the Warriors. The Warriors can go through stretches where they don't make a bucket for like 5 minutes, and all of a sudden they'll score 50 in a quarter.
That's fair enough. I want to say Howard, by the way, to your point, is picking off everything in sight this year. The first 2 picks by Mahomes yielded just 3 points for Miami, so when you get the opportunity, you got to cash in, and they weren't able to do so even though they jumped out to that early lead. Dan, thank you very much. We'll look forward to seeing you on Get Up this morning at 8 a.m. Eastern with Greeny and the gang. Thank you.
Thanks
Theo.
And just a reminder, beginning Tuesday, January 5th, Mike Greenberg's show Greeny, immediately following us on ESPN Radio. Greeny will take you inside the stories of the day as only he can, have the newsmakers you'd expect, and interact with you every single weekday. From Keyshawn, J. Will, and Zubin, right into Greeny, weekday mornings on ESPN Radio, once again, starting January 5th. I want to mention one other thing, guys. The most amazing stat line of the weekend didn't go to Pat Mahomes for once, as Key said. He may be on the trade block, so whoever comes in for Pat Mahomes is still going to have, obviously, the great work of Tyreek Hill. Think about this just for 1 second. Tyreek Hill yesterday. Guys, just think about this. A lot of numbers coming here, but just think about this. 2 touches. His first 2. 2 touches, 32 rushing yards, 44 receiving yards, 2 touchdowns on 2 touches. 2 touches, 32 on the ground, 44 in the air, and 2 touchdowns. And that's why the Dolphins found out the Chiefs were a little too tough yesterday. Dan mentioned the offensive line, the big problem for the Steelers, a shell of itself. Short passing game. They can't go deep. From undefeated to underwhelming, Key and Jay really break down, in addition to what Dan said, what is wrong with the Steelers, especially moving ahead. That's after sports. 11-2 now. They've dropped 2 in a row after being the NFL's lone undefeated. They actually got into the postseason even before kickoff yesterday. So if there is some small solace for Pittsburgh is that they are in the postseason. And oh, by the way, the best way to snap your losing streak, next up for the Steelers, Monday night on ESPN at the Cincinnati Bengals. Let's roll with some key observations.
Steelers and Bills.
And Key, real quick, I want to mention key observations brought to you by Geico. Whether you rent or own, Geico makes it easy to bundle home and car insurance. Go to geico.com today. Let's start with Sunday Night Football and your observations.
Well, I will start off by the running game with the Pittsburgh Steelers. There was no running game. You know, a lot of people felt like James Conner getting him back would add something to the running game. It was not there all night long against the Buffalo Bills. They've got to figure out how to get this thing fixed, fellas. If they don't, then they're going to find themselves one in and one out in the playoffs. I'm telling you, it has to be portable. They haven't had a solid running game since Le'Veon Bell. They've got to figure out how to get this thing going if they want to continue to run the ball with play-action style football, because as Dan Orlovsky just mentioned on the show, they don't have a vertical pass game. In order to be able to get that vertical pass game, you've got to run the football so those defenders can start to get nosy and start to creep toward the line of scrimmage.
Cardinals at Giants.
You know, when you start to look at the New York Giants yesterday against the Arizona Cardinals, they got taken to the woodshed. And defensively, Daniel Jones offensively did not look like himself, looked like he was still hurt. If I'm looking at this football team, I'm saying to myself, they are not going to win the division after starting 1-7. I thought that they would. Alex Smith and the Washington football team certainly has surpassed them in my mind.
Colts at Raiders.
Well, I don't even really care about talking about the Raiders as much as I want to talk about Phillip Rivers and the Indianapolis Colts. Here's a guy that we all laughed at and talked about at the beginning of the season because he was throwing interceptions and turning the football over. We saw that Cleveland Brown game. But since then, he has bounced back. He went to Las Vegas. He didn't gamble. At least he didn't gamble on the Raiders. He gambled on himself, and he won big time. They went and took care of business. It looks like it'll be between them and Tennessee for that division, and they may just come out on top.
Chiefs and Dolphins.
Well, here's what I would say about the Chiefs. The Chiefs are certainly at the top of the class, although Patrick Mahomes did throw 3 interceptions. That 3 interceptions that he threw didn't mean anything. When you talk about a team that is getting it done, look at where they're at. I mean, they're going to probably wind up being the number 1 seed again at home in the snow trying to get to the Super Bowl. Unbelievable.
Saints and Eagles.
Now, Taysom Hill's magic probably did just run out. 3 straight games that he won. He ran up against the Philadelphia Eagles. He didn't play great. He didn't play crazy bad, but he didn't do enough to win this football game. A lot of balls thrown in the dirt, sacked a couple times, held on to some things, threw an interception. So when you start to look at where Taysom Hill is, I'm sure Sean Payton is hoping and praying that Drew Brees is healthy enough to go against the Kansas City Chiefs, because if he's not, they could very well lose that football game.
And that's their matchup on Sunday. Jay, you just heard Key's observations. What are your observations on Key's observations?
Yeah, I think there was only one that he missed because before his game on Sunday against the Jags, Derrick Henry came into the league came into that game only one of 4 players in NFL history with 3 200-yard games and 2 TD games. With the performance he had yesterday, rushing for 215 yards, 2 touchdowns, he passed Jim Brown, Barry Sanders, and LaDainian Tomlinson. It's really time for us to start mentioning King Henry's name constantly in the MVP conversation. I understand he may not surpass Patrick Mahomes or Aaron Rodgers, but he's at least 3rd, and we need to start saying his name constantly. Well,
I think he certainly will get the conversation. May even collect a vote or two. Who knows? You know, it's going to be those 2 guys that you mentioned, and Patrick Mahomes, Aaron Rodgers, and then you're going to go to quarterback and Josh Allen, and maybe Derrick Henry he's around there just for conversation's sakes. But you're right, he will not win it.
Keyshawn, J. Will Zubin, presented by Progressive Insurance. All of our guests join us on the Shell Pennzoil Performance Line. The Pennzoil Performance Line will take us to Chicago here in just a bit. Just a couple quick observations on the fellas' observations. To Jay's point, Derrick Henry, the NFL's rushing leader last year.
You sound like Mike Tomlin right there.
No doubt about it. No doubt about it. Find one word, just keep using it, keep going to the well, and see if it works. I want to mention with Derrick Henry, we have not seen the NFL have a back-to-back rushing leader since LT about 13 years ago, and Derrick Henry is perhaps on track to do that, not something you see every day. Speaking of being able to rush the ball, to not rush the ball, Jay, you mentioned this, Key, you mentioned this, Orlovsky mentioned it. Steelers' last 2 games combined, right? You don't have a short passing game, you don't have a long passing game. They can't run the ball. 68 yards in their last 2 games running the ball. And last thing for the Colts, who are playing under the radar.
That's not Steeler football, man.
That is not. No question about it. They've always been able to stop the run and run the football. If you're wondering how tight it's getting between Tennessee and Indy, both are at 9-4, but this is how deep you have to go. The Titans right now hold the edge based on a better win-loss record in division games. So you got to creep a little bit further down the tiebreaker scale because those two teams who have won on each other's fields are going to go down to the wire to decide the AFC South. Still to come, the Bears certainly aren't going to win the NFC North, but how much did one masterful performance from one quarterback cool the hot seat for one